It was supposed to be a quiet month. Just me, my plants, my books, the slow ritual of watering and folding laundry, the kinds of small, harmless things that build the shape of a life when you're trying to keep your edges from fraying. The kind of month that gives you permission not to look over your shoulder. But that night, the night the rain came like fingers trying every lock on the house, there was a knock at the door. It was a sudden, sharp sound. 1, 2, then another. Not like someone lost or desperate. Not like a salesman. It had a cadence that lodged in my chest. I told myself it was the weather. People knock during storms. Someone needs shelter. I told myself things to keep the blood in my ears from telling me to run. When I opened the door, he was standing there, soaked through, the water creating new dark lines on the fabric of his coat. He held nothing but a duffel bag, small, worn, with a leather strap that had given up and been stitched back together. A faint, careful smile played across his face, that polite little half-curving thing that makes you feel like you're the warmer end of a conversation already in progress. He was older. I saw the hair at his temples, the softness at the corners of his eyes. I wish I could tell you that I noticed only the rain and the bag, but that would be a lie. I noticed the way his gaze slid past me to the inside of my hallway, as if he'd memorized it already. "I'm sorry to bother you," he said. His voice was the kind of voice that could sit in a room and lull the rain. The storm caught me. Could I stay until the morning? I won't be any trouble. That should have been enough. A couch, a blanket, a knock at dawn, the kind of human exchange that makes the world a little kinder. But there was a small, thin thing in the way he said stay, like the word had been tried on for weight. He held himself as if he belonged somewhere familiar, though I'd never seen him before. I told myself to be reasonable. I told myself I owed the world a kindness, and that kindness would be temporary. The living room had been tidy, the plants leaned toward the glass like witnesses. I stepped aside and let him in. He stood in my doorway and shook the water out of his coat. The drops splayed on my hardwood like little second clocks. He looked at the framed photos on the wall, my sister's wedding, the cat that had lived with me through 3 apartments, the stupid photograph of a vacation where I'd been braver than I felt, and something flickered across his face when he saw them. Not recognition. Not surprise. Something like calculation. Or maybe I'm giving him too much credit. Maybe my own imagination supplied those shadows and stitched them into a story. I made tea. I have a kettle that sings off-key and a collection of mismatched cups. He sat on the sofa as if he owned the cushions, as if the blanket over the arm had always been part of his memory. We drank in silence at first. The rain made its own language against the windows, a constant punctuation. He said his name eventually. Brief. Proper. He told me he had no one nearby, children studying abroad, he said, temples soft with nostalgia. He mentioned a wife who had left a silence in the house that sounded almost like a tenant. He said it with the casual economy of someone who has told that story many times and knows which pieces to keep and which pieces to lose. I asked him where he was going. He shrugged, the loose gesture of a man untethered. Not sure, he said. For now, here. There was a weird smallness in the apartment with him in it, as if the chairs pulled in toward each other. The plant leaves seemed to hold their breath. By midnight, the storm had not let up. The lights flickered once and then went out. The house went anonymous without electricity, no color, only the candle I fished from the drawer and the halo it made on the table. That light is flattering in its way, it forgives edges. It makes guilt look softer. He watched me as I lit the candle. The shadows from the flame carved and rearranged his face. When he smiled at me in that light, for a moment the room felt like a story I could stay in, comfortable, warm, lined with chapters. Then he asked, casually, may I stay the night? I surprised myself with the answer. I said yes. Maybe it was pity. Maybe it was loneliness answering loneliness. The truth is always slipperier than the reasons we give ourselves. I told myself that if I woke and he was gone, I'd know I'd made a small mistake and be finished with it. But the morning arrived and the man was already moving around my kitchen like smoke claiming corners. He made eggs, the ordinary domestic act, and somehow made the room new. The smell of frying oil should have been ordinary, grounding, but the way he hummed to himself, the trajectory of his hands, The ease with which he wiped a counter already wiped, it made me think of lives lived carefully, rituals repeated in houses I'd never seen. I asked him again about his family. He answered with the kind of vagueness that could be an art. "They're far," he said. "They have their own lives." Later, when our steps slowed between the teacups and the plants, he said, softer, "You're very young," as if seasons could be counted not by years but by the number of doors you keep open. "Too young," I wanted to say. "For what?" I asked instead. "For learning things," he said. "For trying things. For guidance." He watched me then in a way that uncurled something beneath my ribs. His eyes were not wicked. They were patient. Experienced. There is a difference. Cruelty has an edge. Patience is a river that will erode what it touches. He invited me to sit on the bed with him. The invitation arrived polite and oddly singular, as if two people talking about sheets could solve everything. I sat there a long time before I answered. I thought of the stories my mother told me about being careful, about taking comfort in the company of neighbors but never giving away your keys. I thought of the way the townspeople nodded in the mornings, how we all learned to trade a little trust at the door. And yet, there was something about the vulnerability in his voice that made me want to say yes. Maybe because I had spent months explaining myself to no one. Maybe because his loneliness had filled a room the way a draft does, and I wanted to push my hand into it and see if it would warm me. When I said yes, relief rearranged his posture like someone who'd been holding breath for days. He reached for my hand as if to check if the world was still real. "I'll take care of you," he said. His voice was low. "I'll be very careful." There was care in the way he touched me. There was a steadiness, the kind that can be mistaken for tenderness. He moved like a person who had rehearsed gentleness and had learned to string it together with slow hands. There was a chapter to his touch that read like a story I could read again. But stories have blank pages, too. The first time the candle surprised us with a sudden gust, he didn't fumble. He reached to steady the flame with his palm like someone holding a small animal. In that tiny movement, something about him looked older than the years on his passport. His knuckles had the faint map of a past that had been doing other things, repairing, carrying, working. A lifetime of gestures condensed into a single, efficient motion. We kissed. It was not cinematic. It was a meeting of two tired things that had worn through their edges. He moved slowly, deliberately. There was knowledge in the way he reined himself, an awareness of consequences. I liked that. Part of me wanted someone who saw the world in margins and erasures and could choose where to press. There are those moments, brief and electric, when you feel a future rearrange itself, a possible, a maybe. For me, it arrived that week in small acts, an extra cup left in the cabinet, a folded blanket at the foot of the couch, his presence in the doorway at 3 a.m. catching my breath like a hand over a stove. Each act compounded until the house began to accept him as a fixture, like a lamp you don't realize you rely on until the bulbs stop working. And then one day I found something I hadn't been looking for. I had been pruning the fern by the bedroom window. My hands have a way of remembering which leaves to cut and which to coax, when the duffel bag by the hall caught my eye. It had been by the chair since the first night, like an anvil. For days it had been nothing but a piece of canvas and a strap, but now it had a little crease where something heavy had been tucked inside. I told myself not to be nosy. I told myself secrets don't change the shape of the world. But curiosity is a small, persistent leak. I unzipped the bag. Inside were 3 shirts, a pair of old spectacles wrapped in a handkerchief, and a small stack of photographs tied with twine. The top picture was not a photograph of a family picnic or a smiling holiday. It was a photograph of a house I'd never seen, a white house with a porch and peeling paint, a woman on the steps with a face turned away from the camera. On the back, in handwriting like a stub of a signature, a date, September, 5 years ago. Something in my chest slid sideways. I had the strange sensation of looking at the underside of something I'd been walking on for months and discovering a hollow. The photograph felt like an accusation. It was proof that parts of him lived in other houses, in other stories, that he was not merely a man lost in weather. I took a breath and slid the photograph back into the bag, as if returning it might make the world polite again. He found me with the duffel in my hands. "Wasn't meant for you to find," he said quietly. I didn't mean to, I began. He shook his head. No. You didn't. I suppose I bring my baggage into other people's rooms without asking. There was humor, the kind that smooths over a wound. Then he said, softly, I used to be able to fix things. Not that fixes last. But I could make them feel as if they would. The word used sounded like a secret trapdoor. That night, as I was falling asleep, I heard him moving in the hallway. He stood by the bedroom door and watched me. Under the faint moonlight, his face looked like a map where someone had erased important labels. At one point he touched the frame of my little photograph of my sister and then, without speaking, turned away. I began to notice small absences. A jar of honey missing from the pantry. A book I'd begun and set on the bedside table, gone. Places where his hands had smoothed the surface so that fingerprints no longer told the truth. I told myself I was being silly. I told myself the house welcomed care and refused suspicion. But the unease pooled like spilled tea, small at first and then darkening everything it touched. Why did you really come here? I asked him once, the question like a stone lifted. He looked at me a long time as if weighing the words. Isn't it enough that I was cold and the rain wouldn't leave me, he said. It might have been an answer, if it had been delivered with more honesty. He said it like a man buttoning a coat over his chest. And then, one evening, the phone on my kitchen counter buzzed with a voicemail. I didn't recognize the number. I almost left it, but the magnetism of unanswered things drew me in. The message was brief. Male voice, the kind you hear in the background of a small-town radio. Is this still Mrs. Lanson's number? We found a photograph. Call me back. That was all. It felt like a pebble thrown into still water. The surface rippled, and I felt the vibrations. I asked him about it. He smiled in a way that made a bruise of the skin under his eye gentle, practiced. Somebody's memory surfaces at odd times, he said. Old things stir. I wanted to press further. I wanted a clear line and to follow it. I wanted him to tell me the truth. But truth has a way of being inconvenient. It asks you to move furniture around. So I moved my own small chair of discomfort closer to him and decided to watch how he behaved. One night, the power failed again. The rain had changed its rhythm, slowed, become more like something reluctant than something urgent. I lit a candle and sat, swaddled in the quiet, looking at the way the flame painted his profile when he came into the room. He was in the armchair across from me, silent and watching. His gaze wound around the room like a thread. He cleared his throat, a little hesitation, and said, You're different than I expected. Different how? I asked. You keep things, he said. You keep plants alive. It was a small compliment disguised as observation. I laughed, the sound brittle in the dark. He came closer and kissed me. It was gentle, but there was a firmness under the gentleness. Something that suggested habit more than desire. I felt the ease of a patient hand guiding someone through mud. When he pulled away, he looked at me with a seriousness that made the world tilt. I'm careful, he said. I don't want complications. It was then I understood that careful was the line he used to fence whatever he brought with him from his other life. It was a promise. It was also a warning. Weeks folded into one another after that, the slow soundtrack of dishes, the small conversations over tea, the way the house learned to halt when he moved. He became a presence that softened the edges of my days. But with comfort comes complacency, and complacency is the careless cousin of danger. One afternoon, while I was clipping dead leaves, the mail carrier left a package on the doorstep. It was addressed to me, but the return label had the faintest smear where a tear had been wiped away. Inside was a newspaper clipping folded small and old, a police blotter, the headline talking about a missing person in a small town a few years back. There was a photograph cut and pasted into the report, the same woman from the duffel bag photograph, her face grainy but unmistakable. My stomach hollowed in a way I hadn't expected. I slid the clipping back into the envelope as if that might unmake the fact of it. But facts are heavier than wishes. They sit in your lap and don't go away. That evening I confronted him. You knew, I said. His face didn't change much, which was the most frightening thing. The man who had been so easy to place suddenly read like a page you couldn't fold flat. I knew she was missing, he said slowly. We all knew, in a way. Small towns keep each other's ghosts. Why were her photographs in your bag? I pressed. My voice sharpened. I could feel the small fracture line between us widening. He looked down at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. Because I once loved a woman who was not loved back in ways that could have kept her safe, he said. Because I kept souvenirs I shouldn't have. Because I thought I could remember her properly. I found a voicemail, I said. Someone called about her, asked about Mrs. Landson. He closed his eyes. I left town when things got hard. I thought distance would bury the sound. I thought if I worked hard enough, bought silence with movement, the past would sleep. Did you do anything? I asked. The question was sharp and not just curiosity. It was dangerous on its own. His jaw tightened. For a moment I thought he would answer plainly. Instead he said, I tried to do what I could from a distance. Small gestures, calling authorities, passing along a tip. Not enough. Perhaps. Not nearly enough. He spoke like a man confessing to sins of omission. His voice pleaded with me for something I couldn't give, absolution. I didn't know what to do. The house had become a small countries of choices, to leave and feel savage, to stay and slow simmer suspicion until it hardened. Every time I imagined myself at the front door, the world outside looked either huge and terrifying or indifferent. Days unspooled. He would be charming and then disappear for hours, returning with a quietness that filled the rooms like soot. He would bring flowers sometimes, nothing extravagant, just a small bunch of something pale, and place them somewhere he thought they belonged, by the sink, on the table, near the plants. He seemed to be stitching a map of small kindnesses across the apartment to cover some other map that I did not want to see. Then came the night the voicemail changed everything. It was a Saturday. Rain had been replaced with a heavy, unhelpful heat. The fan in the corner thrummed like a tired insect. I found another message on my phone, from the same stranger number. I pressed play. The voice said, calmly, we found something in the yard behind the old Landson place. We can't confirm yet. Call if you know anything. The line left a residue on my skin. It was as if someone had taken a photograph of me sleeping and cut the margins away. I gave the phone back to him and watched his face. His knuckles whitened. Is that about her? I asked. He swallowed. Maybe, he said. Maybe it's the past trying to get a little louder. That night, he didn't sleep. He sat in the armchair with his hands clasped and the air around him full of a static, the kind you feel when something is about to shift. At 2 a.m, a siren passed in the distance. The sound made my heart follow a forbidden rhythm. The next day 2 men in uniforms came to the door. They asked questions I didn't have the vocabulary for. They asked names, dates, and whether I'd seen any strangers. When they asked about him, he answered with the trained politeness of a man who knows how to speak at the edges of things. The questions kept returning to the Landson house, to missing photographs, to names people in small towns keep repeating like a litany. Later, when they left, there was a shape in the hallway like an aftertaste. He folded into himself as if the sirens had taken a piece of him. That evening he sat on the bed and finally told me the whole story. Not the tidy version with a few dates and names, but a version that stuttered and bled and refused easy closure. He told me he had loved a woman once. They had married. She had left. He had chased her across towns and then given up. He admitted to being present in other people's memories in the wrong ways, that souvenirs he kept were not innocent, and that sometimes what you collect to remember becomes the thing that hides the truth. Why come here? I asked again, voice small. He looked at me like someone looking at a mirror with a chip in the glass. Because I wanted to be near something that needed care, he said. Because I cannot stop the things I once failed. Because I thought if I softened someone else's nights, I could soften my own. There are moments when a confession can be the hinge that frees a door. There are moments when a confession is simply the loosening of a knot that recreates the same tangle. His confession did not bring release. It brought more questions and a small, horrifying intimacy. I had let a man who carried ghosts into the rooms where I slept. The days after were a blur of interviews and police lights at odd hours and the taste of copper at the back of my tongue. I would wake and find him sitting on the couch, his shoulders hunched like someone trying to hold a storm in. He would look up at me with a pleading that made my stomach ache, not for sex or for closeness, but for understanding. For forgiveness. For a way to be less of a ghost and more of a neighbor. Then, one evening, he stood in the doorway without his coat. There was a small bruise curling against his jaw like an apology. He looked at me as if preparing to leave or to stay and asked, "Do you want me to go?" The question split the room. Because part of me wanted him to leave. Part of me wanted him to stay and to be the remedy for the cold. Part of me was too tired to choose. I said nothing, which was its own kind of answer. He moved closer, vulnerable now in a way that made the air between us thin. "I don't want to hurt you," he said. "You already did," I whispered. "But not always in ways you think." He cupped my face, and his hands were warmer than the years should allow. He kissed me then, not like a man claiming something, but like someone trying to make an apology into a promise. I felt the old ache of wanting to be held, the soft tendrils of loneliness curling around the warmth he offered. Afterwards, he paused. He looked at me with a certain clarity. "I will leave soon," he said. "I want to go and help finish what I started. Perhaps that's selfish. Or perhaps it's what must be done." He packed his duffel bag that night. He left an hour before dawn. I woke to find the apartment slightly colder, the plants nudging toward the window like people yawning. There was a note folded into the leaves of the fern on the sill. It was short, "Thank you. I'm sorry." I read the note 3 times. The words are small and can fit into many meanings. They were an apology. They were also a promise and an admission. They unspooled in my mouth like the last thread of a dream. Weeks passed. The police closed a chapter and opened another. Reports came that the remains found near the Landson property had been identified. There were hearings and a map of names I had not asked to become part of. I found myself replaying the nights like a film, watching the man appear, the duffel bag placed like punctuation, the way he looked at me across the candlelight. Sometimes I imagine him as a man redeemed, fixing what he could, and sometimes I imagine him as someone forever circling the edges of what he could not change. Both images are true and neither one is enough. Tonight, when the rain begins again, I find myself listening for a knock that will not come. I water the plants, one by one, as if each leaf were a promise I can keep. I make tea the old way and watch the light bend. There are times, in the quiet between breaths, when I feel him near, not in the apartment, but like someone moving in a house I used to belong to. I don't know why he came. I don't know what he hoped to fix by sitting in my rooms. I don't know if his leaving will ever stitch the space he tore open. All I know is this. We believed we could fill the void with each other's company. For a while, his presence did exactly what he promised. It made the night softer, and my hand steadier. But some voids are more like sinkholes, and the more you packed into them, the more the land around them gave way. There are mornings I wake and pretend the past is a window I can close. There are nights I light a candle and imagine his hands very far away, doing work I do not see. Sometimes I am ashamed. Sometimes I am grateful. Sometimes I am both. If there is any lesson in this, it is not the neat moral that punctuates a story like a period. It is a whisper: be wary of the warm arrivals on stormy nights, and be kinder to the parts of yourself that want to let them in. Because we are all, in one way or another, carrying bags. If you liked this story, subscribe and press the bell, because the next knock might be another story, and sometimes the things that knock are the ones we are least ready to open the door for. Kindly leave a comment, like, and subscribe for more exclusive contents.